Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out to be here. I just want to give you an idea of how tonight will be structured. You can obviously see the itinerary in front of you. The first half will be based on my research on Philip Glass's work Satyagraha, after which we'll take a very quick break, and then we'll move on to what has been my main research during my time at NEC, which is research based on these 2 volumes found at the NEC Library Archives based on a collection of vocal works. This will also include a very short performance at the end. One may ask why I've chosen these 2 very contrasting works. Well, 18th century is what has been my key focus, and I think studying these manuscripts has really solidified that. In addition to that, I also decided to delve into my cultural background of India and Hinduism to see how that could be put in a Western operatic context. I think Philip Glass's Satyagraha really exemplifies that. On that note, let's get started with the first part, which is on Philip Glass's Satyagraha and the Indian music and culture used within it. The term Satyagraha, which essentially means holding firmly to the truth or truth force, carries the force that ultimately led India into independence in the year 1947. It was coined by a figure whose name is not only synonymous with Indian history, but also world history, and that is Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, or Mahatma Gandhi as a title of respect. Philip Glass has composed over 25 operas in his career, but the most definitive group is undoubtedly known as the Portrait Trilogy. This is a group of 3 operas that are thusly named because they are these large-scale works based on influential historical figures. Therefore, we have Albert Einstein in Einstein on the Beach, Mahatma Gandhi in Satyagraha, and Akhenaten in, you guessed it, Akhenaten. Philip Glass focuses the narrative of Satyagraha, which is actually, as you can see, the second of the trilogy, and actually Glass's 3rd opera overall. He focuses the narrative of this opera on Gandhi's 21-year period living in South Africa as a young lawyer. The goal of my research was to analyze Glass's compositional process, study the literary sources as well as the libretto, to see how exactly Philip Glass has incorporated Indian music and culture into this Western opera. The 2 decades, spanning 1960 to 1980, Philip Glass attempted to pave the way for his own definition of minimalism in a late 20th century style. It was during this period that Glass discovered a dimension to art and music in the Eastern world, which would truly mark a turning point in his compositional journey. In the early 1960s, Glass found himself in somewhat of a spiritual and cultural juncture with the desire to study more about the Eastern cultures, specifically South Asian. He started following the practices of Hindu spiritual leaders known as Swamis, and he took a trip to Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon, and different parts of India. Glass's time in India would truly become a formative period in his compositional journey. In fact, he describes in his memoir titled Words Without Music, being struck by the diversity of India upon his first visit. One must understand that India in the 1960s was vastly different to the globalized and cosmopolitan country it is today. Because after just over 10 years of independence, India was a recovering economy and trying to find its own identity following 200 years plus of British rule. Glass would go on to visit India at least once a year for the next 10 years through the 1960s, sometimes staying for weeks or even months at a go. He familiarized himself with the foundations that exist in Hindustani music, Indian classical music. Hindustani hails, of course, from the northern part of India. And the foundations of Hindustani lie in the complexity of the rhythmic cycles and the melodic cycles. During this period, specifically between 1961 to 63, this is also when Glass met and worked with Maestro Ravi Shankar for the first time, who's a very famous Indian sitarist. He was a very famous. Glass assisted Shankar on a film score, and Glass describes this experience as his experience with, or his first experience with the non-Western music, and it being very intimidated despite being a Juilliard-trained artist. One of the most notable moments for Glass was when Shankar mentioned there would be no film score. Instead, Shankar would simply watch loops of the film on repeat and compose and improvise on spot. But the true awakening for Glass to compose Satyagraha occurred at the end of the decade in 1969 during one of his annual visits to India. Glass met, this was to the northeast part of India this time. Glass met an owner of a very small rug shop, and in passing, he began a conversation with this rug shop owner. This owner had a picture up in his store of what Glass described as a small, skinny, older man dressed in white. And upon asking the shop owner who the man in the picture was, Glass encountered Mahatma Gandhi for the first time. Now, just to provide some context on Gandhi, because not many people associate him with South Africa, Gandhi was born on October 2nd, 1869, and he was born in the northwest part of India, today known as Gujarat. Because of his religious upbringing, especially due to his mother, Gandhi practiced Jainism, a religion that's very relevant in India today as well. And he had strong beliefs towards vegetarianism, purity, and most of all, nonviolence. He intended on practicing law, and he actually moved to Natal, South Africa, in 1893 as a young lawyer, originally on a 1-year contract with a law firm, but he ended up staying for 21 years until 1914, during which time he emerged as a social activist. When Gandhi arrived in South Africa, a country that was also under British rule like India, and just like the entire Indian community of South Africa, Gandhi was openly exposed to racism and discrimination. The Indian community in South Africa at that time largely was made up of laborers brought from India by the British, mainly to work on sugarcane plantations. A very well-known story about Gandhi in his early days in South Africa involves a train journey that he took from the province of Natal, where he was living, to Transvaal, a different province, for which he purchased a first-class train ticket. However, during this journey, he was bodily ejected from the train, despite showing and protesting his first-class ticket. This was, of course, he was ejected by a group of Caucasian men. And this is a story that really resonated with Philip Glass, and was one of the reasons why he ended up composing this opera. The true force of change for the Indian community in South Africa occurred on October 29, 1913, when Gandhi led what is popularly known as the Newcastle March. This was once again from the colonies of Natal to Transvaal, and over 5,000 Indians, including women, marched in this protest under the principle of Satyagraha, protesting essentially many of the laws that were placed against the Indian community, or the Asian community. Now, the last part of history I will talk about before going into the actual opera is kind of a shift in gears, because it's to do with Hindu mythology. Why am I talking about Hindu mythology? Well, throughout the opera, Glass and librettist Constance de Jong draw parallels between Gandhi's life and the Hindu mythological epic known as the Mahabharata. In Hinduism, instead of referring to these legendary stories like the Mahabharata as mythology, they are known as itihasa, which is a Sanskrit term for true history. Essentially, itihasa is a collection of religiously and culturally significant works that are believed to be a part of ancient Indian history. The Mahabharata is a very vast story. I will condense it into about 2 sentences for you. It involves a feud between 2 branches of a family to gain power over a kingdom. The main focus is the battle itself, the war that takes place between these 2 branches. One is led by Arjuna, who you can see in the picture here at the back holding the bow. He is the rightful heir to the kingdom, and he is fighting his stealthy and ambitious cousin Duryodhana. Now, amidst this great battle, Arjuna is very overwhelmed at the prospect of fighting his own relatives and leading his great army. So he turns to his friend and his charioteer, Krishna, who's also in this picture in front. Krishna provides support and guidance to Gandhi during this time, and that begins an episode of the Mahabharata known as the Bhagavad Gita. Over time, the Bhagavad Gita has become the most sacred Hindu scripture, essentially teaching one how to practice Hinduism and what it means to. The Bhagavad Gita is a dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna in the Mahabharata, spanning over 18 chapters and 700 verses. So you can only imagine how big the entire Mahabharata is. All right, enough history. Let's look into the actual opera now. Some very quick facts about Satyagraha. It premiered on September 5th, 1980 in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. The opera is divided into 3 acts, and the libretto is done by Constance de Jong. Each act is named after a historical figure and guardian from Gandhi's life. These 3 guardians are physically present on stage on this sort of above-level staging. They have no dialogues or no music in the opera. Their only role is to just observe the scenes transpire. These 3 are essential figures from Gandhi's past, present, and future. Therefore, we have Leo Tolstoy in Act 1, a source of guidance to Gandhi in Gandhi's younger days, and they exchanged many letters. Rabindranath Tagore, carrying on the tradition of large beards. He was Gandhi's contemporary, a Nobel Prize-winning Indian poet, and a very famous or key figure in Indian literature. He was also Gandhi's close friend. Lastly, we have Martin Luther King Jr., who reawakened Gandhi's movement of nonviolence in the American Civil Rights Movement. I have a picture of what the stage looks like. This is from the Metropolitan Opera premiere in 2011, and that is Leo Tolstoy sitting on top, observing the scenes of Act 1 transpire. The librettist Constance de Jong has borrowed the entire text, or the entire libretto from the opera, from verses of the Bhagavad Gita. That's why the entire opera is completely sung in Sanskrit. De Jong has laid out the text phonetically to help the singers grasp the nuances of this unfamiliar language and maintain loyalty to Sanskrit roots. The Indian custom of teaching the Bhagavad Gita is followed through an oral tradition being passed down in the form of storytelling. Myself included, I learned a lot about it through my grandmothers. In Hinduism, it's believed that the Bhagavad Gita is meant to be listened to and not read. And because of this, many opera productions of Satyagraha, including the Met Opera premiere in 2011, do not feature subtitles in respect to this tradition. Now, the 3 acts, they are divided into 7 scenes in total, and they are meant to depict Gandhi's 21 years living in South Africa. But in the opera, all of the scenes take place over a single day. The first scene beginning at the break of dawn, and the last scene ending at dusk. However, the story is not shown chronologically, and instead is shown through thematic development of the philosophy of Satyagraha. So the scenes are not in order, but they do depict important events during those 21 years. I've created this table just to kind of make it easier to understand what I'm talking about. We obviously spoke about the 3 acts, and they're all named after these important figures. The time of day, starting at dawn, ending at dusk, and the 7 scenes that are named after important events. They're also aptly tied into verses from the Bhagavad Gita. Now, the most important part of this opera, the music, let's look at some of the analysis. The two driving forces of the music in Satyagraha are the text and the rhythmic cycles. I've analyzed just the first scene of the opera, and I'll share this insight with you. The reason I chose just the first scene is because I think it reflects well what the subsequent scenes look like. Glass's minimalist style of composition often includes a repetition of a short motive, gradually developing through an additive process of layers, more beats or pulses, or an increased density in sound. This first scene, titled The Kuru Fields of Justice, clearly evidences how the rhythmic cycles respond to the vocal lines or the text. As the opera begins, Gandhi has just endured the unfortunate train incident of being thrown out of the first-class compartment. Simultaneously on stage, Arjuna is present from the Mahabharata amidst his battle and is very overwhelmed. They both are calling out for help. That is what the scene sets up. I've created this slightly scary-looking diagram to illustrate what the first scene looks like. You can see it's been divided into modules. Each box over here is titled a module, and these modules are based on the meter or the rhythmic cycles. Similarly, I've also divided the scene into sets. So 5 sets, essentially one row is one set. Let's take a look at the first set, or the first row, just to understand what's going on. The first set begins with Gandhi singing alone, and the meter starts at 5/8, and it keeps growing through this very gradual process until it settles at a 9/8 meter at the end of the set. After this, it sort of instantly compresses, and it goes back to, it dilutes to a much smaller meter, this time 6/8 to account for the syllables in the text. This is a good time to explain what I mean by an additive process. In a general sense, an additive process involves a motive that is constantly repeated, and as the repetitions progress, there is some gradual development or expansion in a musical element. In this case, it's the rhythm. This additive process in the meter happens a few times, at least across the first 3 sets. But this additive process is not restricted to the horizontal movement alone. It's also present in the vertical movements as a character name is added. So in the second set, Arjuna joins Gandhi. Third set, there's a trio, etc. There is a gradual increase in the density of the sound. So that's also an additive process. Now, this conspicuous reset I spoke about at the beginning of each set, during this moment, there's absolute focus drawn to the libretto. In the second set, when the meter is 6/8, Arjuna and Gandhi sing together, and they're calling out for help. They're calling to Krishna. The text in this moment is as follows: I am confused about my duty. I am besieged with anxiety and faint-heartedness. Similarly, in the third set, when Krishna joins the two to form a trio, the text or the meter dilutes to 5/8, and the text is as follows: If you refuse to fight this righteous war, abandoning your social duty and reputation, you will certainly incur sin. Now the fourth set is, the trio continues, but they are joined by this large chorus, and the text is very powerful. I'll put it up on screen to show you. This ill beseems a noble, wins a heavenly state, but brings dishonor, Arjuna. Give up this vile faint-heartedness, stand up, chastiser of your foes. The intensity of the music burgeons through the repetition of this one phrase. Arjuna at this time holds up a physical copy of the Bhagavad Gita to foreshadow its significance that it'll have on Gandhi's narrative. Simultaneously, there is a backdrop that emerges, one of the Mahabharata, the battle in the Mahabharata, and the other sort of a battle between a group of Caucasian people versus a group of Indian South Africans. This is an explosive moment in this fourth line, or this fourth set. All of the characters sing as well as this large chorus, and the meter is 17 pulses per cycle, or 17/8. This is truly the climax of the scene, because after this a subtractive process begins. The scene winds down and it circles back to just Gandhi singing alone. Needless to say, this scene follows a circular structure, but that extrapolates across the opera, as in the very last scene of the last act, Gandhi once again is standing and singing alone. I want to show you what this that explosive moment looks like for a few seconds. This is the Metropolitan Opera in 2011. This gentleman in blue is Krishna. That's how he's usually depicted, in blue. And then you'll see Gandhi on your left with glasses, and Arjuna on your right holding up the Bhagavad Gita. I'll stop there, even though it's so beautiful. I'm sort of winding down my own presentation, and with that I want to talk about some important elements in the music. One is to do with the instrumentation. The instrumentation of Satyagraha does not include any traditional instruments. And I think this is deliberate because the narrative of Gandhi and Satyagraha is something that is not restricted to Indian history alone. Having said that, Glass has very appropriately highlighted one instrument, and that is the flute. Why the flute? Well, it's commonly associated with Krishna in Hinduism. Krishna is present as a peripheral character throughout the opera, minus the first scene that you just witnessed, where he's physically present on stage. Other than that, he's depicted through, of course, the libretto, the text from the Bhagavad Gita, the use of the flute, and the idea of a guardian embodied through Tolstoy, Tagore, and MLK Jr. The flute is particularly vivid in the second scene of the opera titled Tolstoy Farm. You see this consistent motive in the flute of an ascending and descending E Phrygian scale that's played. This leads me to my next point. Why E Phrygian scale? This scale is intentionally placed because it uses the exact same notes as the Bhairavi rag in Hindustani music. This rag is often associated with a new dawn, a continuation, and a rebirth, or Anusha, as it's called in Sanskrit. This rag is very important in the opera. It's also recalled at the very end of the opera when I mentioned Gandhi stands and sings alone. He sings an E Phrygian scale. I'll just show you what that looks like. This is a picture of the score from the very last, one of the last few pages of the opera. Gandhi's libretto in this moment while singing this E Phrygian is some of the most powerful spoken by Krishna from the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna essentially tells Arjuna to act in balance by protecting those who are virtuous, punishing those who are immoral, and establishing and upholding the principle of dharma, or righteousness, in the universe. This scene and this text confirms Krishna's strong presence and actually signifies this new avatar of Krishna being born through Gandhi. This also mimics the overarching sentiment of Hinduism in these concluding moments of the opera, denoting the belief of a new dawn and a continuation. I'll show you, to conclude, what this last scene looks like, once again through the Metropolitan Opera production. But before I say that, I'll just conclude this presentation by saying, I think what Glass does through Satyagraha is beyond just incorporating Indian music and culture. I think he really reflects Indian stage art. In many forms of Indian stage art, the storyline is a portrayal of Hindu mythology, and much of the focus is given to the storyline and the text. Glass follows this tradition by forming this quasi-mythic portrayal of Gandhi, borrowing from sacred texts to narrate the story. And I believe this really shows what traditional Indian stage art is. I'll show you this final scene, and as I pull it up, I just want to say this brings me to the end of this segment. We will take a very quick break after this. It really will only be 5 minutes because I do want to get on to the next segment and not keep anyone too late. Okay, here it is. That's Martin Luther King Jr. giving his speech in the background. I'll end with that. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back, everyone. This next segment is titled A Study of an 18th Century Manuscript, Exploring Neapolitan Vocal Works and Uncovering the Enigma of Pierre Dutillieu. This has been my primary research over the past year to year and a half with the faculty here at NEC. This is essentially a study of 2 manuscripts that encompass different kinds of vocal works. These vocal works range from arias to recitatives, sacred pieces, ensemble numbers, and what look to be standalone works. These are housed at the NEC Library Archives, and I actually have them with me here today. The library was very kind enough to allow me to borrow them tonight simply to keep on display. They're a little fragile, so I've taken many pictures so you'll get an idea of what they look like. The composers featured in these manuscripts belong to a group of late 18th century Neapolitan composers, and majority of the works have been handwritten, although a few have been printed and affixed. The origins of these works are somewhat mysterious in the NEC library. Records indicate they belonged to this conductor from New Hampshire named James Bull, who passed away in 2019, and upon his passing, his wife donated these volumes to NEC. Beyond this, not much is known. For the purpose of my research, I conducted an examination of both volumes, delving into their distinctive characteristics, the compilation of the vocal works, of course, the featured composers, and their structural organization. My aim was to potentially unravel the origins of these works, as well as their ownership history, and an approximate period in which they were created. Furthermore, I specifically delved into one composer by the name of Pierre Dutillieu. I encountered his quintet in Volume 2, and I realized upon research that his contributions are somewhat underrepresented, despite being a fairly successful composer of opere bouffe in Vienna in the late 18th century. Consequently, I embarked on a journey to delve into his life and his compositions. Before that, let's just look at the overall volumes. This is kind of a picture of them, and they are titled Tome 1 and Tome 2, meaning Volume 1 and Volume 2. Obviously, they are a set. In total, there are 34 works that encompass both volumes. Volume 1 comprises of 23 arias from various Italian operas, 1 sacred aria from an oratorio, 2 standalone compositions, and 1 aria left unnamed. Volume 2, though a similar size to Volume 1, exclusively features ensemble numbers from Italian opera, 7 of them to be exact. Let's start with Volume 1. Volume 1 begins with this handwritten index that lists all of the pieces in the order of how they appear in the volume. This is stuck to a thicker sheet of paper to secure it, and it's likely to have been made towards the end of creation of this volume once all of the pieces were placed in order. I also mentioned some printed works. Well, there are 2 of them to be exact. One is an aria from Pasquale Anfosi's La Forze delle Donne, and another is an aria from Giovanni Valentini's Le Nozze in Contrasto. These 2 works are placed at the very end of Volume 1. Now, in addition to the index I showed you earlier, there are also these 2 vocal exercises that you can find in the beginning of Volume 1 before any of the vocal pieces begin. There is a solfeggio and a short handwritten note on some introductory vocal technique and theory. These exercises imply that these volumes were perhaps compiled by some teacher for vocal performance pedagogical purposes. Most of the works in Volume 1 has been done by one person, including the index and majority of the vocal works. I base this claim off of a few idiosyncrasies I found in the author's handwriting to help me identify their work, which I'd love to share with you. Some of these idiosyncrasies are the double bar lines at the end of each page, even if the piece is not finished. That happens regardless. There's a method of drawing C, a very unique shape for this common time or cut time symbol. And lastly, I just took a specific word, in this case, trezzetto or trio, and how it appears in the volume versus how it appears in the title of the aria. It's obviously been done by the same person. Similarly, there's another handwriting style I found in the solfeggio, which we saw earlier, and only one of the arias in Volume 1. That is Giovanni Paisiello's O Momento Fortunato. Some characteristics of this person's handwriting are the single bar lines at the end, which we're all used to, the curvature of the 8th note stems, and lastly with these quarter note sort of rest squiggles that this person draws, which I think are quite cute. Paisiello's O Momento Fortunato, which features this handwriting style, is the only handwritten aria that features a cover page. Unlike any of the other works that simply have the title of the work on the first page of the music. This clearly indicates it's been done by another hand and attached to this volume. Now moving on, there is a portion of this volume that has been affected by an ink stain. And this ink stain sort of covers the title of 3 of the pieces, which I have in a list. There is one aria by Francesco Bianchi from his opera Olandese in Venezia, and then 2 quartets from Marco Portugallo's opera Due Gobbi. Considering these are the exact 3 works that are affected by this ink stain, perhaps these 3 works were their own unit and they were copied individually or as a unit and then attached to this volume. However, this is inconclusive to say because these works are part of a larger collection. By that I mean there are 5 works in total in this volume from Marco Portugallo's Due Gobbi and 3 works from Bianchi's Olandese in Venezia. The handwriting between those non-ink stained works versus this ink stained unit do not differ at all. So it's not conclusive to say that these are a separate unit that I've titled the ink stained unit. But it is curious that these are the only 3 works that have this stain. I have a picture of what the stain looks like. Bianchi's work is slightly less affected than Portugallo's 2 quartets. This manuscript is also missing one aria. Pietro Guglielmi's Quartetto seria nella Deborah e Cisera, perfido a queste cesso con recitativo, is missing. This aria is mentioned in the index. I have a picture of what it says in the index, and it says that it's meant to appear from folios 182 to 199, but those are entirely missing. This is the only aria from an oratorio. It's a sacred work. It's from Guglielmi's Deborah e Cisera, and this is one of two works by Guglielmi featured in this volume, but the other work is not a sacred piece. It's an aria from one of his operas. The nature of this missing work is unclear, whether it was handwritten or printed. The other work by Guglielmi is handwritten, albeit from a different work. Perhaps this was also handwritten. But it's noteworthy that the position of this work, how it appears in the index, indicates that it was towards the end of volume 1, meaning it was placed where all of the other printed works are currently sitting. Additionally, the way the title appears in the index is a bit peculiar, especially with the way con recitativo has been mentioned at the end. This author usually mentions recitative at the beginning of the title in the index, followed by the name of the piece. This case, recitativo is mentioned at the end, indicating maybe this author of the index copied this title exactly how it appeared on a cover page of a printed work. Nevertheless, it is inconclusive to say the nature of this work. There is a question, of course, of who ended up binding this volume 1 at the end. One can assume the person who wrote most or produced most of the work, including the index and most of the vocal works, was the one to end up binding it. But we can't conclude this for two reasons. One, many of the pages have been cut on top. You can see over here in the index, a word has been cut, as well as a phrase at the bottom. Maybe the person who made the index and most of this work would have accounted for that difference in page size when binding it. But more convincingly, there are a set of collection numbers that you can find at the bottom left corner of select pages. Not all, but select. This is not to be confused with the folio numbers on the top right. These are different. These collection numbers have not been followed chronologically when designing this volume, nor are they evenly spaced. In fact, some of them are entirely missing. But what these do tell us is that these works featuring these collection numbers were probably part of a different collection that was then disassembled and then reassembled to form our existing volume. Now, regarding the time frame of this volume, there is something interesting that happened that is both unfortunate and miraculous. There's a leather covering, obviously both are covered by leather, but the spine of volume 1 with the leather covering has experienced some deterioration, resulting in a small opening that reveals this slightly faded, yellowish tinted page listing repertoire that I will present to you in a table format. I'm not going to expect you to read this. These pieces in this particular page date from the very late 18th century, mostly from the early 19th century, and they provide a loose indication of when volume 1 was made, because obviously this sheet of paper was used to secure the spine. These are the pieces under the spine. None of them are vocal works, but they're all by very popular composers, pan-Europe, during that time. I'll get back to more about the time period of this volume in a second. I'll just very quickly tell you about volume 2. Volume 2 is much more well put together. It comprises, like I said, exclusively of ensemble numbers from various Italian operas. And it features a total of 7 ensemble pieces, all from different operas, and a total of 4 composers. The arrangements for these vocal works range from between 3 to 6 voices. A very quick examination of Volume 2 immediately distinguishes it from Volume 1. It, of course, contains significantly fewer pieces, and it has a much clearer distinction in terms of its contributors. The first piece is by Giuseppe Sarti. It's a quartet, and it's unmistakably crafted by an individual with this unique handwriting, absent anywhere else in both volumes for that matter. Similarly, the second piece is this ensemble number by Giulio Benedict, and it bears this distinctive handwriting, of course, but more noticeably, it's done on this smaller sized paper, indicating it was clearly a separate entity before, then inserted into the volume. That leaves us with the last 5 pieces in this volume, which I have titled the Blue Tinted Unit. And I'm going to be referring to that funny name several times this evening. These last 5 pieces are clearly presented as a cohesive collection. They share identical handwriting, and they are presented in the same format featuring this cover page. But noticeably, the reason I call it blue tinted is because it's been done on this very distinctive blue shaded paper. It doesn't look blue here, but I promise you, when you see it in person, it's pretty blue. The only uncertainty regarding the contributors in Volume 2 lies in the index. I'm not talking about a comprehensive index like Volume 1 has. Volume 2 does not feature any comprehensive index. Instead, it has this one small index situated midway that delineates and outlines just these 5 blue-tinted works. This is what the index looks like. It remains unclear who might have created this index. It doesn't resemble the handwriting styles of any works in either of the volumes. And it's been done on this exceptionally thin blank folio, potentially added towards the end of creating this volume. Additionally, Volume 2 does not feature any collection numbers, nor does it have any pagination or foliation. I think the assembly process of Volume 2 was a lot more straightforward. It perhaps was even just assembled once. The 2 volumes, now that we've seen both, exhibit notable distinctions between them. There's no shared handwriting, no shared paper texture, or even any common composers or works. Their sole similarities lie in the fact that they're both hardback leather bound, and the featured composers are all from the Neapolitan region in the 18th century. The fact that they were donated to NEC together obviously indicates they come as a set, even as they're titled Volume 1 and Volume 2. And I think it's reasonable to infer that Volume 2 serves as an extension to Volume 1 with a specific focus on ensemble works. I've created yet another table. I've shown you a lot of tables tonight. Just to illustrate my interpretation of these 2 volumes divided into units. Volume 1, we spoke about all of these. The Solfeggio and Paisiello's aria feature the same handwriting. Next, we have the Notes on Vocal Technique and Theory, which also features unique handwriting, hence it's a separate unit. Then we have the index, as well as majority of the vocal works that also have a similar handwriting. Of course, the ink-stained arias, handwriting is not a factor in this, but they have that peculiar ink stain, so they must be put in a separate unit. There's too much ambiguity around this missing aria, so it's its separate unit. And lastly, we have the 2 printed works. They're not in one unit because they don't resemble each other in their format. In Volume 2, we have the Quartet by Sarti, once again distinct handwriting. The ensemble number by Benedict it has handwriting that's distinct, but it's also been done on that smaller sized paper. Then we have the index, where it's been done on that very thin sheet of paper. And lastly, the blue tinted unit. Now going back to the time frame of these works. While the exact time frame is hard to estimate, there are some factors or key indicators that allow us to estimate an approximate time frame. These 3 are, of course, the premiere dates of the featured operas. And we have the miraculous yellow tinted page under the volume of spine 1, of the spine of Volume 1, I'm so sorry. And then we have alternative titles, which I'll get to in just a second. Let's deal with the low-hanging fruits first. I'll deal with the Volume 1 spine. We saw all of those pieces in a table format. I'll just tell you all of those pieces range between the years 1788 to 1837. Now, all of the operas premiered in Volume 1 span from 1778 to 1894. Volume 2 is from a slightly different period, a later period rather, from 1782 to 1827. That's a lot of years I just threw at you. What I'm trying to say is these volumes had to have been constructed after the latest premiere of their featured operas, narrowing the dates down to post-1794 for Volume 1 and post-1827 for Volume 2. Now, the alternative titles, I researched each individual opera in both volumes. 3 works in Volume 1 proved to be very useful. That is, Bianchi's Olandese in Venezia, Portogallo's Due Gobbi, and Paisiello's Nina Pazza per Amore. These 3 works that are presented to you on screen right now are exactly how they appear in Volume 1. Olandese in Venezia was originally titled Il Cinese in Italia, and it was used under this title, Olandese, in only one premiere as an alternative title in Turin, Italy in 1794. Similarly, Portogallo's work was originally titled Le Confusioni della Somiglianza, and it was titled or premiered under Due Gobbi in multiple venues between 1794 and 1800. Lastly, Paisiello's Nina Pazza per Amore was originally titled just Nina, and it was featured under this title between 1792 and 1811. Now, taking all of these factors into consideration and assuming these 2 volumes were made around the same time, these volumes are estimated to have been created between 1794 and 1837. I understand that's not narrowing it down that much, but it certainly is better from where we started. Now, I mentioned 2 freestanding works at the beginning. There's a reason I'm circling back to this. One of them was of particular interest. The second of the 2 freestanding works in Volume 1 is titled A Nocturne for 3 Voices by one Gaetano Lovati. You can see his name placed up here. These volumes are structured to be used for some kind of educational setting indicated by the vocal exercises in the beginning and the brief vocal technique given. It's plausible that these 2 volumes belonged to Gaetano Lovati, who's this composer featured in Volume 1. And that's a big statement to make. I'll explain why I think this. I researched all of the composers in both volumes, and Lovati stood out. There's not much information given about him, but from what I could find, Gaetano Lovati lived between the mid to late 19th century as an Italian baritone teacher and composer in Milan. According to a Grove entry of an Italian publishing firm in Milan, Lovati was a teacher at the Milan Conservatory of Vocal Performance. There are also 2 pedagogical books I found on Lovati, both published in Milan, one in 1857 and the other in 1868. The first of the 2 was written for Lovati's children, filled with vocal technique, basic exercises, some introductory theory, as well as a personal note on his teaching styles and methods. I also found 2 entries of Lovati in an Italian magazine mentioning his name as a baritone in 2 performances on separate occasions, indicating he had an active performance life as well. All the other composers featured in these volumes are fairly renowned, or at least somewhat renowned, late 18th century Neapolitan composers with, of course, Neapolitan roots. Lovati stands out as a teacher from the Milan Conservatory in the mid to late 19th century, and hence I think there's a chance these volumes belonged to him. Now, the last part of this presentation is, of course, talking about Pierre Dutillieu, who I mentioned at the beginning. In the second volume of the manuscript, I was particularly intrigued by one work, and that is a quintet by the name of Momento, questo, credited to one Signor Dutillieu. This quintet lacks an opera name in its title, and the information about this quintet and its composer is scarce. In this section, I'll share with you my information that I've gathered about Pierre Dutillieu, his works, and I'll discuss my insight into this particular quintet. My research approach for studying Dutillieu's background initially started with this very broad biographical search in music history encyclopedias, namely Grove and MGG. After that, I further looked into the bibliographies of these two sources to deepen my understanding of Dutillieu's body of work. Then, to gain more nuanced perspectives, I dedicated a trip to Vienna this past summer, where I spent a significant portion of my time studying the remaining works of Dutillieu. Dutillieu spent many of his last years living in Vienna, that's why Vienna. I visited the archives of the Burgtheater, the Theater Museum, as well as the Austrian National Library in search of whatever remaining manuscripts I could find of Dutillieu, both autographed and copied, of course. Lastly, upon returning to NEC, I spent time with the Italian teacher here, Dr. Francesca Santovetti, who helped me understand the text in the remaining works of Dutillieu, specifically this quintet. This quintet, A momento questo, was written for 5 voices alongside 2 E-flat horns, 2 oboes, 4 violins, 1 viola, 3 bassoons, and 1 clarinet introduced later in the piece. Notably, the voice parts have been written for 5 distinct characters, which you can see over here, starting from Carolina all the way down to Barone. This underscores the role of this quintet in an opera. Additionally, upon closer examination of the libretto, it becomes evident that this quintet conveys a tone of surprise, tension, and unease regarding something the 5 characters have just witnessed. In the late 18th century, it was customary in opera, specifically opera bouffe or comic operas, to incorporate a mid-act ensemble that either solidified a moment in the plot or further advanced it. The text of this quintet follows the structure of a mid-act ensemble, wherein the 5 characters engage in some discussion of something they've just observed and their course of action going forward. A very important characteristic of this quintet becomes apparent when observing how it has been placed in this volume and how it's been catalogued. The quintet belongs to that so-called blue-tinted unit I mentioned earlier, meaning it was already a part of that collection and then incorporated into volume 2. However, a critical point to consider is that unlike all of the other ensemble pieces in the blue-tinted unit, Dutillieu's is the only one that lacks an opera name in its title. This raises the intriguing question of whether the compilers of the blue-tinted unit, or the volume in general, were aware of the opera name, or if it was already a mystery at that point. Let's talk about the composer himself, Pierre Dutillieu. Some very quick facts about him. He was a French-born Italian composer. He was born in Lyon, France, on May 15, 1754, and he passed away in Vienna on June 28, 1798. He initially studied law. He pursued a career as a lawyer, but then upon taking a trip to Italy in 1781, he began composing full-time. This was likely influenced by his courtship with Irene Tomeoni, a soprano, whom he eventually married in 1787. The couple resided in Naples for about 3 to 3.5 years, during which Dutillieu worked and composed for the Teatro del Fondo, both opere bouffe and ballets. And in 1791, Irene Tomeoni was this rising star in the performance world, so they were both summoned to the Burgtheater in Vienna, where Dutillieu was appointed a composer. In Naples, Dutillieu's work garnered positive success, especially his ballets, or positive reception. However, upon relocating to Vienna, his career as an opera composer was not very successful, many of his opere bouffe receiving unfavorable reviews. There's a book by a scholar named Otto Michner about the Burgtheater in Vienna during this time, And Michener mentions Dutillieu on one occasion, only to suggest that many of his commissions and his premieres came because of his wife's popularity. Critically, Dutillieu often was told that his opera bouffe was unoriginal and unenjoyable, but he did find some success in his ballets, which were relatively well received and enjoyed multiple performances at the Burgtheater. There are some accounts, or at least just one account actually, that exists in the diaries of Karl von Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf was this government official living in Vienna in the late 18th century, but more importantly, Zinzendorf kept this very detailed diary documenting his life during this time, starting from 1761 in Vienna. And this included all of the performances he visited, which were many. Zinzendorf mentions Dutillieu on one occasion for the premiere of Dutilleu's opera Il Trifono d'Amore on November 14th, 1791, stating that it was very bad music and very clumsy, and he insinuates that Dutillieu stole the music. I don't know what I would do in that case. In contrast, Zinzendorf openly expresses his admiration for Irene Tommeoni, Dutillieu's wife, and her performances on multiple occasions. It's worth noting that Irene Tommeoni hailed from this renowned Italian Tommeoni family of musicians and composers, and she eventually ascended to soprano stardom in Vienna, assuming the position of the Neapolitan prima buffa at the Italian Opera Company of Vienna. The couple, Dutillieu and Tommeoni, seem to have been financially secure, and I base this off of some notes I found regarding payments to them in the accounts of the National Court Theatre in Vienna. This following table indicates what I found. The payments are from the beginning of 1791 to the end of 92, so it's a 2-year time frame. They made a total during this year of 10,424 florins. I then tried to see what that could be worth in today's dollar value. I found this New York Times, I know it's a rabbit hole, but bear with me. I found this New York Times article from 1991 about Mozart's economics. Mozart was obviously a composer living in the 18th century, and during the last couple of years in Mozart's life, he earned between 3,000 to 4,000 florins, which according to this New York Times article would be worth 10x, so 30 to 40,000 US dollars, but that is once again 1991 dollar value. From this, at least we can infer that Dutillieu and Tommeoni earned 10x of what we saw, which is 104,000 US dollars, once again 91 dollar value. Extrapolating from this, based on the currency going up or the value going up, they made approximately $240,000 or 120 a year. Now keep in mind, according to this framework and these calculations, this is at least what they would have been making, because these are the only accounts that I found of any payments to them. Following Dutillieu's passing in 1798, Irene Tommeoni returned to Naples and she continued her career as a singer. At the time of her demise in 1813, she possessed 2 houses, one in Vienna and one outside the city, and her estate also included about 2,100 florins, indicative of her fairly comfortable life. During my visit to Vienna in August 2023, I toured the Burgtheater and I inquired about the archives containing Dutillieu's works. Sadly, a significant portion of the Burgtheater archives were destroyed during the Second World War in 1945, resulting in limiting resources. Nevertheless, the Theater Museum in Vienna did retain some of Dutillieu's original playbills from his operas, which I managed to access, and I could take pictures of it, which I have for you today. I found 4 playbills of Dutillieu. Through this, I was able to piece together some of his operas and the premieres and understand the positions he held. We obviously knew that he was some kind of composer for the Burgtheater, but these playbills confirmed that he held that position until the very end of his life. Dutilleu's body of work in Vienna from 1791 when he moved there until his death consisted of at least 5 opere buffe. These are the playbills of 4, but I found a 5th opera, which was arguably his most popular opera, seeing as it enjoyed the most number of performances across Vienna. It remains uncertain whether Dutilleux composed any additional operatic works prior to relocating to Vienna or during his time there, but according to the Grove entry of Dutilleux, the remainder of his opere buffe is lost. Dutilleux is also credited with more than 12 ballets and at least 1 instrumental opus. These are the 5 opere buffe, just show you in yet another table. The one with the asterisk next to it is the opera that I couldn't find a playbill for, but it is probably his most successful work. It's called Gli Accidenti della Villa. Now, looking at all of this, I revisited the quintet in volume 2. I wanted to see if I could find a match to the music, the libretto, or the character names to see where on earth this quintet is from. Unfortunately and sadly, there is no clear correspondence that emerged, shrouding this quintet in mystery. It is plausible that this quintet is from a lost work by Dutilleux, or perhaps a work that remained unpublished or unfinished. There was this tiny ray of hope I had towards the very end of my research. I found this peculiar similarity between Dutilleux's quintet and another work in the blue-tinted unit of Volume 2, that is a sextet from Francesco Nieco's opera Carolina e Filandro. This features, or the similarity between the two works solely lies in the character names. You can see, I promised the last table, where you can see these, there are at least four character names that are similar. I then tried to see if perhaps the libretto was done by the same person for these two works, but Francesco Nieco's libretto for Carolina e Filandro was done by Nieco himself, and I don't know who did the libretto for Dutilleux's quintet. There may be some obscure sort of explanation that Dutilleux's quintet could have been used for a specific performance as an insertion work, but for Nieco's Carolina e Filandro, but that's unlikely. The two composers led very distinct lives. Nieco lived in Italy his whole life. Dutilleux obviously moved to Vienna. Moreover, and more convincingly, Nieco's opera Carolina e Filandro was premiered in 1804. That is 6 years after Dutilleux passed away. So that evidence is inconclusive, and this leaves the identity of the quintet unresolved. I don't want to end on such a negative note. I want to say that it was very enjoyable to study this quintet and these volumes in general, and who knows, going forward, I may find some success in this particular quintet. That brings me to the end of this presentation. We will move on to some performances after this. First, we'll have an aria that I will sing from Gli Accidenti della Villa, Dutilleux's most successful opera, and the aria's name is Teneri, miei sospiri. And the second we have none other than the quintet itself, which I'm very excited to essentially have premiered. I just want to give a very quick vote of thanks to everyone before we go on to this, to the performances. I firstly want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, taking the time out with not so great weather on your Thursday evening. I really appreciate it. I want to thank the 5 performers with me tonight. That is Ty, Benedict, Nicholas, Shayu, and of course the pianist Yusak, who not only helped me perform, is going to help me perform tonight, but he also helped me arrange the piano reduction of Dutilleux's quintet. My time at NEC is concluding soon. I'll be graduating in a few weeks, and I have very supportive faculty to thank for that. Specifically Dr. Sean Gallagher, who helped me with my research on these particular volumes, Dr. Katerina Markovich, Dr. Mehmet Sandikol, and Dr. Helen Greenwald, who is unwell today and who is watching online. It's really because of these 4 people I feel ready to take the next steps as a musicologist. I also want to thank Dr. Kevin Mall and Dr. Katerina Milkovich for their help on my research with Satyagraha. And of course, Dr. Francesca Santovetti, who helped me with all the translations tonight. I want to thank my friends and family who are here today. I'm so sorry. My friends from NEC, of course, and I have some lovely friends who have flown down from DC just for this. And similarly, I have my very loving family who flew down at what I think is 4:30 in the morning from Chicago just for this. That's my uncle, my aunt, and my cousin. I want to... I also just want to thank the NEC Library, of course, the people who introduced us to these two volumes, Dr. Gallagher and myself, Mary Alice and Maria Jane, who it's such a surprise and lovely. It's lovely to have you. And I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to my parents for their unwavering love and their support. They're watching today from Singapore alongside some extended family, my aunts and uncles. I also want to thank my sister and my brother-in-law who are watching from Texas. And I want to thank my husband's parents who are watching from India. So a lot of people from a lot of different parts of the world. This concert is dedicated to my family and most of all my loving husband Anirudh Shankar, not related to Ravi Shankar. He's always been a pillar of support for me, and he flew down, I think, essentially an hour before the concert started from DC. I'm very lucky to have him. He was also very helpful in the logistics of tonight. My time at NEC, like I said, is concluding, but this evening really commemorates my 2 years here, and I'm excited to see what goes forward, but I won't forget these 2 years by any means. They've served as such a lovely foundation to my life as a musicologist. So thank you. Thank you very much. While we set up for the performance.